Tere tulemast tagasi.
Welcome back from lunch break. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. I also hope that you had time over lunch to talk about values, for example, cooperation, professionalism, the future of adult education and how it is influenced by all these factors. Now we have arrived at a point in our conference where we are going to take a global view of these changes that are taking place. And to introduce this topic, I thought about my grandparents. I thought about how they probably didn't leave their home region or the home villages voluntarily, because our families were quite settled. And great-grandparents are the ones who probably didn't leave the countryside willingly, and my grandparents probably didn't leave the country willingly. They would go abroad very seldom. But today, sometimes on Monday we're in China, and Friday we're in the USA. And something that moves faster than us is information, capital, and other such phenomena. On the one hand, of course, that can't help but change the world and the society. Mobility has much lower thresholds now, and it has no limits. And since all these factors, since mobility influences society so much, it also influences how we teach and how we learn. I'm very glad now to introduce our next presenter, and I'm happy that he is looking at this aspect in his presentation. The next presenter is the Chief Executive Officer of the Global Learning and Skills Partnership from the UK, Mr. Benoit Charles. Dr. Ben Charles, please.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to start by saying that it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And I'm particularly thankful to Andres for having invited me to address this conference. And particularly so because I'm going to be talking about something that I'm very passionate about, something that I'm very interested in, and I hope that's something that you as adult educators will also be interested in. I want to talk about competencies for adult educators, but I want to focus on what is described as global competencies for adult educators. And as you are well aware, the role of the adult educator has been changing over the years. Say, what it was 20 or even 15 years ago, it's actually changing. Not just changing, it's getting a bit more complicated. You are having to have a broader range of skill sets, and in a sense, what you're doing is to reflect the changing world. Well, that was the bit part of me. But before I do that, what I'd like to do, it's really contextualize what I'm going to say. So I just want to refer to some of the social, economic, political, and environmental context in which my talk is going to be framed. I've got lots of slides. I'm not going to refer to all of them or discuss them in detail. It's just by way to refresh our minds or to remind ourselves. Okay, just some of the context. And I'll probably refer to some of the key ones. And the first one is issues around global interdependence and interconnectedness. We well know how the world is so interconnected and interdependent. Just think of yourselves, what you had for lunch today, or the clothes that you're actually wearing. Just think of where those things have actually come from. Or just think of what had some wonderful coffee downstairs. Just think of what happens if either Brazil, Kenya or Colombia have a bad coffee harvest. Just think of how it might impact on you right here. And obviously, being from the UK, I would obviously mention Brexit, which has implications as well. Other issues, and we know of those issues, so I'm not going to go into them in detail just to remind ourselves. But the one I really wanted to highlight here was the issue around the imperative of sustainable development. Because in a sense, what used to happen, or the model of development education used to be raise awareness among citizens of the North so they can actually help and support those of the South. Now the paradigm is actually changing. In a sense, now we're all in this together, and it's for all our benefit. So it's actually changing. And these, of course, have implications for adult education and some of those social changes. Now, again, I'll highlight some of what I see as the kind of key ones. You've got big issues around population changes in Europe, and as we had from the first speaker this morning, the issues around diversity. The world is naturally diverse, and that's something we have to acknowledge. It's not about forming a judgment whether it's good or bad. It's just a fact you have to acknowledge. But for me, the key issue is how that process is actually, how do you manage that kind of diversity. You've got issues around politics, the rise of populism, the kinds of people that have been elected to public office. We've got big issues around impact of technology and social media. And of course, a big issue now is about expectations and lifestyles of the millennials. The younger people, they've got different expectations in terms of where they're going to live, where they're going to work, with interest in things like travel. They've got friends all around the world. And all of these things will inevitably impact on adult education. So let's just look quickly at some of the impact. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, just to highlight what I see as the key ones here. And the first one, that's quite important. Because the world is changing very rapidly, we are living in an increasingly globalized world, we are required a new range of skills, and if we are to navigate the world, this changing world successfully, we require a certain level of skills and different skill sets. And I've made reference to the interdependence as well. And that is the key issue. And what we're saying is that there is a need for educators to develop global competencies in themselves. Because at the moment, what's happening is there is a lot of activity, and I'll come back to that later, happening about global education in schools. It's getting established in schools. So I am not trying to make the case for a global education. That case is well made. And you are well aware, at the EU level, they are funding development education or global education. It's happening through the United Nations. And national governments are also promoting it as well. And I know in Estonia in 2009, you had a big consultation exercise where you produced a concept paper on global education. So I'm not trying to make the case is already well made, but I'm trying to make a slightly different case. And I think the final point I wanted to highlight there is it's well established in schools. If you're going to have globally competent citizens or young people, then obviously you'll also require globally competent teachers. And the question is, are adult educators competent? If not, how can they become competent? And what global competencies are they supposed to be having? Now, touch on those very briefly. And on this particular definition of global education, I just wanted to emphasize one thing, is perhaps the second point here. And that's where global education is very different from other forms of education, other subjects. You will learn geography, you will learn maths, you will learn English, or even some technical skills. You go out and work and you do get a job. But the issue about global education, it's about engagement and action. It's meant to bring about changes. It's no good doing a global seminar work where at the end of it you've got a lot of knowledge. You've got a lot of knowledge. It's not about that. It's trying to find the wherewithal so you can bring about changes to ensure that we do have a sustainable world. So it's different from other forms of education. It's about action. And action can only be taken by people who are empowered to do so or have the means of taking action. Okay, I won't go through this in any detail, but some of the issues around global education, the issues around, you may well know about terminology. It's called different things in different countries, and I've just listed some of the ways in which they're called in different countries. And I'm sure there are many other names as well. But I wanted to come on the final point, because I'm not going to go for all of them, and it's this issue around initiatives. And as I said earlier, there is a lot happening in schools at the moment. But I did a lot of reading, all the research I did, and what I checked was that 99% of the initiatives is in the formal sector and in schools in particular. In the adult education sector, there is hardly any initiative at all. Well, there are some projects, hardly any kind of strategic initiative to promote global education in the, if you like, or the post-16 sector. And that's where my interest is. So clearly, there is a gap in provision in the post-16 sector. And quite rightly, too, that's where the focus should be, because it's in schools. And the rationale for that is because the children who are in school today, they will be the adults of tomorrow, and they will be the main decision makers. But what I am arguing is that there is both an existential and an immediate need for adults themselves to be globally competent. And for the very good reason that, for this is one of the very good reasons. If it's just about young people in schools, think of it, how can we really afford to wait until all of them grow to become adults, to begin to address those issues? We can't. So clearly, what I would advocate would be a kind of intergenerational approach to global education, where you've got both young people and adults, and everyone is involved in this particular process. So that's and this is just the names of some organizations at European and certainly UK level involved in development education. And most of these are in the kind of non-formal sector. So we've got organizations like Deep Concord, that no longer there, but they were involved in this. You've got the Global Education Network in Europe, that's a pan-European network. And these are more kind of British organizations promoting development education. And I just want to put that in the concept of global learning. And I made a point earlier, it's about action. And the key point I want to highlight as well is not so much all the others. You can find information on those from the Andras website. It's this final point here. I believe that global education can be truly transformative. It has the potential to be transformative. And I firmly believe that it has the potential to reduce issues around international conflict, inequality, and really contributing to a more just and sustainable world. Just think of some of our current world leaders, and I'm sure a few names might come to mind, and just think, if they were really globally competent, would there be a general reduction in international conflict and perhaps for a better, just world? I don't want to suggest any names to you, but I'm sure you can think of a few yourself. And we are adult educators, so I don't propose to go through and explain the whole idea about global competence, but I think within this discourse, this particular definition is, let me just take this back. Yeah. It's quite important. So that if you are globally competent, it means you are able to do these things. And I'll maybe just read it out. Global competence is the capacity to analyze global and international issues critically and from multiple perceptions, judgments, and ideas of self and others, and to engage in open, appropriate, and effective interactions with others from different backgrounds on the basis of a shared respect of human dignity. I suppose some might say this has been approached from a kind of a humanistic perspective, which is quite right, because this is about making changes and for a better world. How does that relate to the adult educator? Well, if you're going to have global competent learners, even in schools, where you want to develop globally competent young people, you've got to have globally competent teachers. And therefore, if you put this in the adult sector, then you need globally competent adult educators. And it's just a bit of a description of what you mean by global competence. And that is the key thing. If you accept that there is a need to reflect the changing world and competence, then clearly you need to be competent. And I'll go through this very quickly. What are the competences that adult educators need? Now, very little work has been done in relation to global competences, i.e. to pin down what exactly does the adult educator need to know to be globally competent. And some general work has been done, and I've provided just a general classification of those things. It's about knowledge and understanding, it's about skills, behavior, attitudes, and values. And you provide some general categories there for you. Clearly, an important one is they need to have knowledge of global issues, intercultural knowledge and understanding. And those ones in the middle, that would probably apply to any discipline, but it's also part of it for global competence. And this one there, again, it's much more context related. And we heard this morning about values, and we heard this morning about diversity. And if we wanted to look at this in a little bit more detail, which I won't have time for, but you can begin to break down the knowledge component as to some of the things you would expect the adult educator to know. And these are not learning outcomes. We're not at that level of detail, just general themes or indicators. And again, a whole range of skills. And you might argue that those skills would probably apply to most disciplines, quite rightly too. But obviously, you couldn't have that kind of framework without identifying those skills. And attitudes, some of the key attitudes here. And I think a key one is about openness, comfort with ambiguity and unfamiliar situations. And here I think we're talking mainly about kind of being able to operate effectively in intercultural situations, i.e. being interculturally competent also. And questioning, and it's a critical discipline as well, so you need to question prevailing assumptions. Well, and empathy, humility. And behaviors, and that is key because global education is about effecting change, bringing about changes, and that can be measured in terms of your behavior and how you behave. And that moves us to the next question: who should be globally competent? Well, in adult education, the answer is everyone involved should be competent. From the senior managers to your adult learners, everyone should be globally competent. Effectively, what this is calling for is globally competent adult education institutions. That's how you can really bring this about at the strategic level. And you can try to characterize the globally competent person. Yeah. Characteristics, educators. Yeah, it means you must be able to help learners become competent. And what would a globally competent educator look like? Would you know when if one actually hits you in the face? Well, I mean, we can provide a bit of a descriptor. That's something I adapted from a publication, because most of these things are on school, so I acknowledge the source, but I did some changes to reflect the adult education context here. And maybe just take, because I don't have much time, maybe just 30 seconds just to reflect in terms of what we're saying a globally competent adult educator should be, and just reflect on your own global competence. I mean, and ask yourself the question, do I really feel globally competent in that particular context? And maybe other things that I want to do, things that I actually want to follow up. And I'm quickly going to go through some of the challenges that presents to organizations and individuals. Obviously, it's not something you can do in a fragmented way. It's got to be at a strategic level, at a policy, national level, institutional level. We'd expect these things to feature in organizational mission and vision statements, in the curriculum clearly, and the issues around how do you prepare adult educators to deliver this curriculum, or this perspective rather. It's not a curriculum, it's a perspective. And that's a key bit of it, because adults are actually wanting occasionally a free space or a safe space to discuss some of those issues. And just some of the challenges. There's a confusion about terminology I referred to earlier on. Adult educators, as it stands, they're overwhelmed by the enormity of the global perspective. It is a huge perspective. Just think of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, what you call the 8 concepts of the global dimension, and you can see the depth of that. There are issues around accreditation, what do you do about that? And obviously, it depends on you, the final one, accepting the purpose of global learning. It is not an uncontested area. It is contested. And just some bits on that, some of those I've referred to before. Issues around, should it be part of initial teacher training? How do you provide opportunities for people to update? And we've talked about them in strategic plans and so on. And in the 51 seconds that I have left, and what I really wanted to do, or to finish, is by really throwing down the gauntlet, or a challenge to adult education. And that challenge is to develop globally competent institutions of adult education. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Ma loodan, et kui te nüüd
I hope that you followed along with this little self-reflection that Dr. Ben Charles called on you to do about your own global competencies. To reflect on them for a moment. I don't think there are any people here today who is like the president that the speaker referred to in a meeting recently in Africa, referred to Nambia, a state that doesn't exist. But now, let's take a few more minutes to discuss at your tables what we just heard, and then I will come around and offer you the opportunity to ask questions. So let's take 2 minutes and discuss.
I think since tõesti. There's a microphone you can use to answer the question.
Okay.
nii, 2 minutit laudkondade.
2 minutes are now up. Attention, please. Here I have the first table, and they do have a question. We have a question, indeed. This one is about the global world and diversity. The question is, in this world, what should be the place that should be retained or obtained or developed by small languages? Because as we know, most global communication is done in English. But at the same time, there are a lot of adults across the world that do not speak English, or it's not their first language. So what do you think? What could be the place of a small language in a global world?
I mean, that's a very interesting question. And you asked me what I think, therefore I'll tell you what I think. It's not necessarily the answer that you want or the definitive answer. But you talked about English. Obviously, because I'm a native English speaker, and therefore, obviously, I would like to promote the use of the English language. But I think that is one of the issues, because earlier we've heard a lot about diversity, about diversity, actually acknowledging diversity and the value of diversity. And I know in many countries, for example, even in my own country, in Northern Ireland, there is now a stalemate between the political parties' coalition. They can't form a coalition government, a devolved government, because they wanted to introduce Celtic language into the curriculum, and there's opposition from the other side. And therefore, that is proven to be a problem. So I think it has a role, but I think I'm not a politician, but there's an economic aspect to it as well. I think one of the barriers is because they're talking about the cost of introducing what they see as a minority language. But I think that every minority language needs to be promoted and protected, because in a sense, that is inherently part of your culture. I mean, how far you take it, the extent to which that will be promoted, how widely it is used is another issue. But in principle, I think they should be promoted, encouraged, and retained. And even in learning, where it can feature in learning, by all means do so.
Okay, thank you. Pakun siia laudkonda küsimuse. Siin ei tekkinud küsimust. Hästi. Ma ei ole selle laudkonna juures veel kordagi.
I haven't been to this table yet. Do you have a question that you could ask based on this discussion? We had a question about what the actual competencies would be in global education. Those of us active here in Estonia, we perhaps need additional training on this topic. Would it be possible for adult education institutions to undertake this topic?
I mean, the answer to this question, I mean, clearly I will say it's a yes to answer to this topic, this question rather. But the issue about those competencies, what I did earlier on, I just highlighted some broad areas of competence in terms of perhaps the knowledge, the skill, the attitude, and the behavior. And I gave some general indicators. But the problem with this at the moment is no one has yet identified the specific competencies that the adult educator would need in terms of, if you like, learning outcomes. There is yet a global competency framework is yet to be developed. So in a way, in a sense, that's probably a challenge to all of us here. It might be the next step. There is some work being done by UNESCO. They published a paper Global Competency for an Inclusive World, and they've mapped out a framework for testing, for the next PISA test, to test young people on the level of global awareness. So maybe that's something one can actually build upon, but certainly adapt it to the adult sector. But that work is yet to be done. So probably you're not in a position to say, yes, this is the knowledge I need to develop. These are the specific skills. There's a lot more work to be done in that area.
Thank you.
Aitäh, kasutan ka võimalust eesti keeles küsida.
I'll use the opportunity and ask in Estonian. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Something that made me think was that, like you mentioned, the world is globalizing increasingly rapidly, and the need for global education is clear. At the same time, we're in a situation where people are different. People understand the situation differently, and learning is different. So what I see is a concern. There is an increasing division among the people who can keep up with this changing world and those who see it as a big obstacle. So in your experience, what are your thoughts on how we can homogenize this process so that as many people could be included as possible? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah. I mean, I'm not so sure about homogenizing issues. I think one of the things we need to acknowledge is acknowledge and appreciate diversity, that things can be different. There is nothing to say that all of us have to do everything in exactly the same way, but we have to acknowledge where things are different. My particular perspective on global education, and the sole aim is to bring about a more sustainable, just, and equitable world. And there's a way in which we can all contribute to that. But the way I think we can bring this about, not necessarily to homogenize, but to get kind of partnership and cooperation, is if citizens of the world do understand some of the kind of the factors, the push factors, the pull factors, and some of the dynamics that's causing these things to happen. Sometimes you see things happening around, and I made reference to some of the global crises earlier around, refugee crisis, migration, and all of those issues, injustice, and so on. Very often, people's attitudes are formed because they don't quite understand what are the factors behind those things. In the end, if they are knowledgeable, they may not necessarily agree, but they do understand, and their attitudes towards some of those issues might be very different. So it's about people understanding, valuing those things, and having perhaps far greater empathy. Moreover, what's happening now is not just about the old paradigm of the North helping the South. If you think of sustainable development, it's affecting all of us. So maybe part of it is about making the case that what's happening in the world to sustain it, it's a job for all of us. And in a sense, we're all in this together. But by of it, it's about education, raising awareness, and encouraging people to act and play their part.
I had another question standing by, but apparently you just answered 2 questions at a time. They said you just answered the other question as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you.